19 gospel legends you didn't know were gay. Gospel music has always been sold as pure, holy, and untouchable. But what if the very voices that built it were forced to live lies just to survive? What if the church praised their anointing while rejecting their humanity? Behind the choir robes and standing ovations, many gospel legends carried secrets that could have destroyed everything. This is not gossip. This is history that was buried on purpose. Stay with us because what you're about to hear will challenge everything you thought you knew about faith, truth, and sacrifice. If you're ready to confront the uncomfortable, like, subscribe, and comment below. Welcome to Black Excellence Legends. Sylvester James Jr. began his musical life not under nightclub lights, but inside the Black church. Raised in Los Angeles, he sang in the choir of the Love Center Church of Christ, where his soaring falsetto immediately set him apart. Congregations praised his voice as divinely gifted, yet that same voice came attached to a personality the church struggled to accept. Sylvester was expressive, fashion-forward, and openly different in a space that demanded conformity. From a young age, he learned that talent could be celebrated while identity was punished. The tension became unbearable. Sylvester was repeatedly reprimanded for being too feminine, forced to suppress mannerisms, and warned that honesty would cost him everything: family, faith, and future. Rather than disappear, he left. In San Francisco, he found freedom in the underground music scene, transforming gospel-trained vocals into electrifying soul and disco. That leap changed music history. In 1978, You Make Me Feel Mighty Real exploded onto the charts, becoming a defining anthem of the disco era and a cornerstone of LGBTQ cultural expression. Sylvester emerged as one of the first openly gay Black superstars, performing in gowns and makeup without apology. His success proved that spiritual intensity and queer identity were not opposites, they were intertwined. Yet the church that shaped him turned away. Invitations stopped. Former supporters condemned him publicly. Even his childhood congregation rejected him, revealing a painful truth. They loved the gift, not the man. Sylvester paid that price without retreating. He continued recording, touring, and advocating for authenticity during a time when visibility carried real danger. Diagnosed with HIV in the mid-1980s, Sylvester remained defiant. He performed until his health collapsed and spoke openly about AIDS when silence was the norm. He died in 1988 at age 41. Leaving behind more than hits, he left a challenge. Sylvester's life forces an uncomfortable question. How many gospel voices were pushed out not because they lacked faith, but because they refused to lie? Sister Rosetta Tharpe. Sister Rosetta Tharpe was not simply a gospel singer. She was a revolutionary force who reshaped American music. Long before rock and roll had a name, Tharpe was electrifying audiences with distorted guitar riffs, rhythmic swagger, and spiritual fire. In the 1930s and 1940s, she sold out venues across the United States and Europe, blending sacred lyrics with blues-infused performance in ways that shocked conservative church leaders. Artists who later defined rock, Elvis Presley, Chuck Berry, Little Richard, Johnny Cash, openly credited her as a foundational influence. Publicly, Rosetta was celebrated as a servant of God. Privately, she lived under constant pressure to conceal her deepest truth. Tharpe formed a profound romantic and creative bond with fellow gospel singer Marie Knight after the two began touring together in the mid-1940s. Their chemistry on stage was undeniable, and behind closed doors their relationship became intimate and emotionally sustaining. But in an era when same-sex relationships were both illegal and condemned by the church, discovery would have meant total destruction. As rumors spread, Rosetta made a devastating compromise. In 1951, she staged a highly publicized wedding in a baseball stadium, attended by more than 25,000 people. The ceremony was spectacle, not romance, a shield designed to silence suspicion. The marriage effectively ended her relationship with Knight and fractured one of the most powerful partnerships in gospel history. Though Tharpe continued performing, the cost was immense. Financial exploitation, declining health, and isolation followed. When she died in 1973 at age 58, she was largely forgotten by the mainstream industry she helped create. Only decades later did history correct the record. Sister Rosetta Tharpe's legacy is now undeniable. Yet her life raises a painful question. How many musical revolutions were born from voices that were never allowed to love freely? Inez Andrews. Inez Andrews was the spiritual backbone of the Caravans, one of the most influential gospel groups ever assembled. Her commanding contralto voice powered songs like "Mary, Don't You Weep," leaving congregations shaken and transformed. Touring nationally through the 1950s and 1960s, Andrews became a model of holiness, strength, and emotional authority within Black church culture. To audiences, she embodied sacred power. Behind the pulpit image, however, Andrews lived in fear. She was a woman deeply drawn to other women at a time when such feelings were labeled sinful, criminal, and career-ending. The conflict between faith and identity followed her everywhere. In the late 1950s, she entered her first intimate relationship with a female singer while on tour, a moment that shattered the internal wall she had built to survive. From that point forward, Andrews lived a carefully managed double life. To protect her reputation, she married a man, though the union functioned more as camouflage than companionship. Privately, she formed meaningful relationships with women, most notably a music producer named Clarice. Their connection was loving but dangerous. When Clarice's husband discovered their correspondence, he violently assaulted her, permanently ending the relationship and reinforcing the cost of exposure. The pressure intensified in the late 1960s when rumors surfaced within gospel circles. Andrews was summoned before a religious council, interrogated, and humiliated. Though no proof emerged, the experience changed her. She withdrew emotionally, toured less, and distanced herself from the spotlight. When Inez Andrews died in 2012 at age 80, she was honored as a gospel legend, but not as the woman who carried decades of hidden pain. Her life exposes a cruel contradiction. A church that preached love while demanding silence. And it leaves us asking how many sacred voices were dimmed simply to preserve comfort over truth. Marie Knight. Marie Knight was one of the most captivating voices gospel music ever produced. Elegant, powerful, and emotionally precise, she rose to prominence in the mid-1940s and quickly became a national sensation. Her greatest artistic triumph came through her partnership with Sister Rosetta Tharpe. Together they formed the most electrifying female duo in gospel history, blending raw spiritual power with musical innovation that drew massive crowds and reshaped worship performance. Behind the applause, however, Marie Knight lived a reality defined by fear. Her relationship with Rosetta was not merely professional. It was deeply emotional and romantic, sustained in hotel rooms, tour buses, and stolen moments of privacy. Their bond fueled their artistry, but it also placed them in constant danger. In a religious world where same-sex love was condemned and criminalized, exposure meant instant erasure. As rumors intensified, pressure mounted. Church leaders warned of scandal. Promoters hesitated. Marie faced an impossible choice: protect her truth or preserve her livelihood. Ultimately, survival won. When Rosetta staged a highly public wedding in 1951, their relationship ended. Marie later married a man, not out of love, but necessity. The marriage provided cover, but no comfort. Her career never fully recovered. Without Rosetta, the spark that defined her sound dimmed. She continued performing, but avoided interviews and refused to discuss her personal life. When Rosetta died in 1973, Marie did not attend the funeral. Instead, she stayed home, holding Rosetta's guitar, mourning privately the woman she was never allowed to love publicly. Marie Knight lived a long life, dying in 2017 at age 92. History remembers her voice, but rarely her sacrifice. Her story forces a quiet question. How many gospel legends survived by giving up the one thing that made them whole? Clara Ward. Clara Ward was spectacle, power, and innovation wrapped into one commanding presence. As leader of the Ward Singers, she revolutionized gospel in the 1940s and 1950s, introducing theatrical flair, glamour, and emotional intensity to sacred music. She toured internationally, appeared on television, and became one of the first gospel artists to perform in Las Vegas. To the public, Clara Ward was untouchable. Privately, her life was tightly controlled. Managed by her domineering mother, Gertrude Ward, Clara's every move, professional and personal, was monitored. When Clara formed a romantic relationship with a young female singer in the early 1950s, the response was swift and brutal. The woman was fired immediately. No explanation, no goodbye. Clara learned in that moment that love would always cost her everything. From then on, Clara lived in fragments. Publicly, she staged relationships with men to quiet suspicion. Privately, she pursued love in secrecy, constantly fearful of exposure. Pastors imposed stricter rules. Touring conditions became oppressive. The pressure never eased. The deepest wound came when a longtime female partner died suddenly in a car accident. Clara could not grieve openly. She referred to the woman only as a friend, swallowing loss without language. The emotional toll was devastating. Her health deteriorated, her voice weakened, and exhaustion overtook her spirit. In 1972, Clara made a rare, subtle declaration during a television interview, saying, "God loves us all, even if we're not the same." The backlash was immediate. Invitations disappeared. Support evaporated. A year later, in 1973, Clara Ward collapsed on stage and died at just 48 years old. At her funeral, the women who loved her sat silently at the back. Her legacy was celebrated. Her truth was buried. Clara Ward's life reveals a painful contradiction. Gospel music exalted her voice while denying her humanity, and history is only now beginning to listen. Alex Bradford. Alex Bradford was one of the most commanding forces gospel music ever produced. Singer, songwriter, choir director, and innovator, he helped shape the modern gospel sound during the 1950s and 1960s. His influence stretched far beyond the church. Artists such as Little Richard, Sam Cooke, and Ray Charles openly studied his vocal phrasing, stage movement, and emotional delivery. Mahalia Jackson once referred to him as the Professor of Gospel, a title that reflected both his brilliance and authority. On stage, Bradford radiated confidence and spiritual power. Offstage, his life was governed by caution. As a gay black man working at the center of conservative church culture, visibility was dangerous. Careers could vanish overnight over rumors alone. Early in his rise, Bradford formed a private romantic relationship with a male pianist while touring in the South. When the relationship was discovered backstage in the mid-1950s, the pianist was immediately dismissed, and Bradford was forced to sign a morality pledge to preserve his career. From that moment, Bradford became meticulous about control. He cultivated a public image of discipline and respectability, appearing with a female companion at events to quiet speculation. Those close to him later described a man who was generous and warm, but emotionally guarded. Love was a risk he could not afford. Despite the personal cost, Bradford's artistry reshaped gospel music. He helped bring gospel techniques into Broadway productions and secular soul, leaving fingerprints on American music far beyond church walls. When he died in 1978 at age 55, he was celebrated as a pioneer, but not as a man who had lived under constant restraint. Alex Bradford's story raises an enduring question. How many gospel giants carried the weight of silence so their music could remain free? Wilmer, Little Axe Broadnax. Wilmer Little Axe Broadnax remains one of the most extraordinary and complex figures in gospel history. Known for his astonishingly high tenor, Broadnax sang with legendary quartet groups such as the Fairfield Four and the Spirit of Memphis Quartet. His voice was so powerful and precise that many listeners believed it could only belong to an angel. Few performers of his era matched his technical range or emotional clarity. What made Broadnax's life remarkable extended far beyond his sound. Born biologically female, he lived his entire adult life as a man in one of the most conservative musical environments in America. At a time when there was no public language or protection for transgender identity, exposure could mean violence, imprisonment, or death. Broadnax constructed his life with extraordinary discipline, careful about privacy, appearance, and boundaries with fellow singers. Despite the danger, Broadnax experienced love. He formed relationships with women who understood and accepted his identity, meeting quietly along tour routes and communicating through letters. One relationship with a woman named Darlene Jenkins nearly unraveled his career when his identity was accidentally discovered backstage in the late 1950s. To protect the group's reputation, Broadnax was quietly removed from prominent performances, and the incident was buried. He continued performing with other ensembles, still living cautiously, still singing with unmatched brilliance. In 1992, Broadnax died at age 71 following injuries from a violent altercation. Only after his death did the full truth of his life become public, shocking the gospel world. Wilmer Broadnax's legacy challenges rigid definitions of faith, identity, and courage. He did not live openly, but he lived authentically within the limits of survival. His story forces us to ask whether holiness should ever demand the erasure of the human soul behind the voice. James Cleveland. James Cleveland was not merely a gospel singer. He was the structural backbone of modern gospel music. Often called the King of Gospel, Cleveland reshaped church music through expansive choirs, orchestral arrangements, and emotionally layered compositions that still define worship today. In 1967, he founded the Gospel Music Workshop of America, GMWA, which grew into an organization with more than 200,000 members worldwide and launched countless careers, including Aretha Franklin's return to gospel. Publicly, Cleveland represented spiritual authority and innovation. Privately, he lived under immense pressure to conform. For decades, rumors about his sexuality circulated quietly within church circles, never spoken openly, but always present. In the gospel world of the 1960s through the 1980s, even suspicion could erase a legacy. Cleveland never married, rarely spoke about his personal life, and carefully redirected attention back to ministry whenever questions arose. Those close to him later described a man deeply devoted to faith, yet visibly burdened by isolation. He surrounded himself with music, protégés, and constant work, leaving little room for intimacy. Whether by choice or survival, silence became his shield. The cost of that silence was profound. As gospel expanded commercially, Cleveland faced increasing scrutiny from both religious institutions and media, forcing him further inward. In his later years, declining health slowed his once dominant presence. When James Cleveland died in 1991 at age 59, churches celebrated his achievements while avoiding discussion of the personal struggles that shaped his life. His funeral honored his sound, but not the weight he carried. Cleveland's legacy is monumental, yet his story exposes a painful contradiction. Gospel music preached freedom while demanding concealment. His life asks a difficult question: can a faith that transforms music also make room for the humanity of its creators? Edwin Hawkins. Edwin Hawkins changed gospel music forever with a single song. In 1969, "Oh Happy Day" became the first gospel recording to cross into mainstream pop success, selling more than 7 million copies worldwide and reaching the top 5 on the Billboard charts. The song's success opened global doors for gospel music, bringing sacred sound into secular spaces for the first time on such a scale. To the world, Hawkins was joy incarnate, warm, generous, and endlessly musical. Behind that public warmth, however, he lived with careful boundaries. Hawkins never married and rarely discussed his private life, a choice that fueled quiet speculation throughout his career. In an era when gospel artists were expected to model rigid moral ideals, privacy was not merely personal, it was protective. Hawkins focused intensely on music education and mentorship, founding workshops and choirs that nurtured generations of singers. Those closest to him later described a man who was deeply compassionate, particularly toward marginalized artists, and quietly supportive of causes related to HIV/AIDS and inclusion, often without public acknowledgement. His activism was subtle, expressed through actions rather than declarations. As gospel evolved in the 1980s and 1990s, Hawkins gradually stepped back from the spotlight. He continued composing and mentoring, but avoided media attention. When he died in 2018 at age 74, tributes poured in celebrating his musical breakthroughs, yet his personal story remained largely unspoken. Edwin Hawkins gave the world a song about happiness that united millions. His life, however, reflects the cost of restraint required to protect that joy. His legacy challenges us to ask whether gospel music can truly celebrate freedom while quietly limiting who its leaders are allowed to be. Carl Bean. Carl Bean's life stands apart in gospel history because he did what few dared to do. He chose truth over survival. Gifted with a powerful voice and deep spiritual conviction, Bean rose in the 1960s as a respected gospel soloist, performing in major Black churches across the United States. To congregations, he represented devotion, discipline, and promise. Behind the pulpit robe, however, was a man struggling with an identity the church refused to acknowledge. Early in his career, Bean was quietly expelled from a gospel group after being discovered in a same-sex relationship. The message was unmistakable. His voice was welcome, but his humanity was not. For years, he tried to conform, believing faith required self-erasure. That internal conflict reached a breaking point in the 1970s when he realized silence was slowly destroying him. In 1977, Carl Bean made a decision that shocked gospel culture. He left the industry entirely and recorded "I Was Born This Way," one of the first openly gay anthems in music history. The song reached the Billboard dance chart and later became a symbol of LGBTQ self-acceptance. The cost was immediate and brutal. Churches erased his name. Gospel radio banned his music. Former supporters disappeared. Rather than retreat, Bean transformed rejection into purpose. In 1982, he founded the Unity Fellowship Church movement, the first Black-led Christian denomination in the United States, created explicitly to affirm LGBTQ believers. Under his leadership, the church expanded nationwide, offering worship, housing, HIV/AIDS support, and spiritual refuge to those cast out by traditional institutions. Carl Bean died in 2021 at age 77. His legacy is not only musical, but revolutionary. He proved that faith and authenticity are not enemies, and that sometimes the most sacred act is refusing to hide. Yvette Flunder. Yvette Flunder's story is not about escape. It is about transformation. Born into a deeply religious family, Flunder rose quickly as a gifted gospel singer and preacher in the 1970s. Her voice was smooth, her sermons compelling, and her leadership undeniable. To many, she embodied holiness and discipline. Privately, she carried a truth that threatened everything she had built. Flunder was a woman who loved women in a religious world that labeled such love sinful. For years, she tried to suppress her identity through prayer, fasting, and self-denial. believing that faith required sacrifice. That belief nearly broke her. Everything changed when she met Shirley Miller, a musician who became her life partner. Their relationship brought clarity, but also danger. When church leaders discovered her truth, Flunder was swiftly removed from platforms. Invitations vanished. Former mentors condemned her publicly. She was left isolated, grieving not only lost opportunities, but a faith community that had turned against her. Instead of abandoning spirituality, she chose to rebuild it. In 1991, Flunder and Miller founded the City of Refuge United Church of Christ in Oakland, California, one of the first major Black churches openly affirming LGBTQ people. What began as a small gathering grew into a global ministry, providing worship, housing programs, HIV/AIDS outreach, and trauma healing. Flunder later became a bishop, advising national leaders and shaping progressive faith movements worldwide. Yvette Flunder did not simply survive rejection. She redefined what church could be. Her life challenges a painful contradiction. If faith claims to be about love, why must truth be punished? Donnie McClurkin. Donnie McClurkin is one of the most commercially successful gospel artists of all time. With multiple Grammy Awards, more than 10 million records sold, and global anthems such as Stand, We Fall Down, and Speak to My Heart, he became a symbol of spiritual victory and emotional resilience. On stage, his music speaks of endurance. Offstage, his life has been defined by controversy, scrutiny, and internal struggle. For decades, McClurkin has been at the center of intense public debate regarding sexuality and faith. He has openly acknowledged experiencing same-sex attraction in his past, while also stating that he believes his faith led him away from acting on those feelings. These statements placed him at the heart of the so-called ex-gay discussion, an issue that deeply divided both church communities and LGBTQ audiences. Critics argue that his narrative reinforced harmful religious ideologies, while supporters viewed him as a man honestly wrestling with belief. What is indisputable is the cost. McClurkin never married, often spoke about loneliness, and admitted in later interviews that his internal battle never truly disappeared. His words revealed a man living under constant pressure to embody perfection for an audience that demanded certainty. Rather than resolving the debate, McClurkin's life exposes a deeper conflict within gospel culture itself, a system that celebrates vulnerability in music, but punishes it in identity. His story is not about labels. It is about the psychological toll of being expected to choose between honesty and acceptance. Donnie McClurkin remains a gospel giant, but his legacy forces an uncomfortable question. What happens when faith leaves no space for human complexity? Vicki Yohe. Vicki Yohe rose to prominence in the late 1990s as one of contemporary gospel's most emotionally resonant voices. Her worship anthem, Because of Who You Are, became a staple in churches worldwide, cementing her reputation as a singer of deep devotion and surrender. To audiences, Yohe represented spiritual purity and humility. Yet behind her ministry, Yohe's personal life became the subject of persistent speculation and quiet controversy. While she has never publicly identified as gay, rumors surrounding same-sex relationships circulated within gospel circles for years, amplified by her private nature and eventual withdrawal from mainstream platforms. None of these claims were ever proven, but the impact was real. As whispers grew louder, Yohe's presence on major stages declined. Invitations quietly stopped. Media appearances faded. Rather than confronting speculation publicly, she chose silence. In rare interviews, she spoke only of exhaustion, spiritual burnout, and the pain of living under constant judgment. Worship, once her refuge, became armor. Yohe eventually stepped away from the spotlight, later sharing that the pressure to meet religious expectations had taken a severe emotional toll. Her story reflects a familiar pattern within gospel music. When artists are perceived as different, silence becomes survival. Vicki Yohe's legacy is not defined by scandal, but by absence. Her disappearance from the industry raises a haunting question. How many gospel voices were not destroyed by truth, but by fear of what truth might cost? Anthony Williams. Anthony Williams, first known to gospel audiences as Tonex, was once hailed as the future of gospel music. Bursting onto the scene in the late 1990s, his debut album Pronounced Tone reshaped contemporary gospel with genre-blending production, raw vulnerability, and emotional depth. His breakout hit, Make Me Over, sold over 1 million copies, earned multiple stellar awards, and positioned him as a prodigy embraced by both churches and industry leaders. Behind the acclaim, Williams lived with intense inner conflict. Raised in strict Pentecostal culture, he struggled for years with his sexual identity while publicly promoting messages of holiness that left little room for self-acceptance. The pressure to conform became suffocating. As rumors circulated, church support weakened, and invitations began to vanish. In the mid-2000s, Williams made a decision that permanently altered his career. He publicly acknowledged being gay, later reintroducing himself as B. Slade. The response from gospel institutions was swift. His music was removed from radio playlists, award platforms distanced themselves, and long-standing professional relationships dissolved almost overnight. Financially and emotionally, the cost was severe. Rather than retreat, Williams reinvented himself artistically. Under the name B. Slade, he expanded into secular music, songwriting, and production, earning Grammy recognition outside gospel and collaborating across genres. His work became more experimental, unapologetic, and self-defined. Anthony Williams' story is not simply about controversy, it is about autonomy. He exposed a hard truth. Gospel culture often celebrates authenticity in sound, but punishes authenticity in identity. His journey forces the question, should faith require silence to survive? Albertina Walker. Albertina Walker was one of the most powerful architects gospel music has ever known. In 1951, she founded the Caravans, a legendary group that launched the careers of Shirley Caesar, Inez Andrews, Dorothy Norwood, and countless others. Known as the Queen of Gospel, Walker's voice, leadership, and discipline shaped the genre for more than 5 decades. She sang for presidents, earned a Grammy Lifetime Achievement Award, and became a symbol of dignity and authority in sacred music. Publicly, Walker embodied tradition and restraint. Privately, she lived with boundaries shaped by fear rather than freedom. Throughout her life, she never married and never spoke openly about her personal relationships. Within gospel circles, quiet speculation existed, but Walker maintained unwavering silence, understanding that acknowledgement could dismantle not only her career, but the institutions she helped build. Those closest to her later described a woman deeply protective of younger artists, particularly those facing marginalization. Rather than challenging the system openly, Walker chose a subtler resistance. She quietly advocated for artists behind closed doors, defended them in meetings, and helped secure opportunities when churches turned them away. In her final years, Walker withdrew from the spotlight, her health declining but her influence unquestioned. When she died in 2010 at age 81, tributes focused on her legacy as a trailblazer, yet avoided the personal sacrifices that shaped her choices. Albertina Walker's life reveals a painful reality. Sometimes survival meant silence, and sometimes that silence became a shield, not for oneself, but for others who came after. Kevin Terry. Kevin Terry was once viewed as a rising force in contemporary gospel. As the lead voice behind Kevin Terry and Predestined, he built a reputation for energetic worship, polished musicianship, and youth-driven appeal. Churches across the East Coast booked him for conferences and revivals, and industry insiders spoke of a long career ahead. His image was carefully constructed around discipline, leadership, and spiritual authority. That momentum ended abruptly. In 2014, a short, unauthorized video circulated online that many viewers claimed depicted Terry in a private sexual act. The clip's origin and context were never publicly verified, and Terry himself did not issue a detailed statement confirming its authenticity. Nevertheless, the reaction within gospel culture was immediate and unforgiving. Bookings were canceled, invitations disappeared, his group disbanded, former allies went silent. Within days, a ministry built over years was effectively erased. What followed was not a public trial, but something quieter and more devastating: social exile. Terry withdrew from public view, avoiding interviews and performances. When the video resurfaced again years later, he chose not to defend himself publicly, a decision that left speculation unanswered but preserved personal privacy. Observers later noted that Terry's disappearance mirrored a familiar pattern. In gospel spaces, perceived moral failure, especially around sexuality, often results in total exclusion rather than accountability or care. Whether guilty of wrongdoing or simply exposed to rumor, the punishment was absolute. Kevin Terry's story is not about scandal alone. It is about how quickly gospel institutions can discard leaders once image outweighs humanity. His silence leaves an uncomfortable question hanging in the air. Should faith communities destroy people without ever seeking truth? Lazarus Lynch. Lazarus Lynch emerged from New York's gospel scene as a gifted tenor whose voice carried both technical precision and emotional vulnerability. As a teenager, he was praised in church circles as a future leader, young, disciplined, and spiritually gifted. Yet from early on, Lynch understood that parts of himself were unacceptable in the very spaces that celebrated his talent. Raised in a strict religious environment, Lynch learned to compartmentalize. Gospel by day, silence by night. Music became both refuge and restraint. As he grew older, the tension between identity and expectation intensified. He performed holiness while suppressing a truth that threatened everything he had built. In 2020, Lynch made a defining choice. During a live performance in Brooklyn that blended gospel harmonies with contemporary expression, he stopped mid-song and publicly acknowledged his sexuality, declaring that faith and identity could coexist. The moment was raw and unscripted. Some in the audience froze. Others applauded. The clip spread quickly online. The consequences were predictable. Certain churches distanced themselves. Invitations slowed. Critics accused him of rebellion. Yet for the first time, Lynch appeared unburdened. He continued performing outside traditional gospel spaces, merging sacred sound with personal truth and building an audience that valued honesty over approval. Lazarus Lynch may not fit the classic definition of a legend yet, but his impact lies in timing. He represents a generational shift, one where silence is no longer the price of participation. His story challenges the gospel world with a simple question: if worship demands truth, why should life require hiding? Yvette Gatling. Yvette Gatling emerged as one of the most compelling young voices in modern quartet gospel, gaining national attention as a lead singer with the Harlem Gospel Travelers. With a rich tenor tone, emotional phrasing, and commanding stage presence, Gatling represented a new generation of gospel artists, rooted in tradition, yet unafraid of innovation. Pastors praised his discipline, audiences felt his sincerity, and critics noted his rare ability to bridge classic quartet sound with contemporary relevance. Yet Gatling's journey unfolded during a moment of cultural tension within gospel music. As conversations around identity, inclusion, and authenticity intensified, younger artists faced a choice older generations rarely had: conform quietly or confront openly. Gatling chose neither silence nor spectacle, but clarity. Through interviews, performances, and social media, Gatling began challenging rigid expectations placed on gospel artists, speaking openly about mental health, emotional honesty, and the damage caused by religious shame. While he did not build his career on controversy, his refusal to conform to unspoken rules made him a lightning rod for criticism. Invitations slowed, online backlash grew, support from traditional spaces became conditional. What distinguished Gatling was not defiance, but consistency. He continued performing gospel music without altering its spiritual foundation, while rejecting narratives that demanded erasure of personal truth. In doing so, he resonated with a generation of listeners who loved the church but felt unseen within it. Rather than abandoning gospel, Gatling expanded its boundaries, performing in spaces that welcomed complexity and building audiences beyond traditional pulpits. His career reflects a shift in gospel culture itself, from rigid control toward contested freedom. Ifedayo Gatling's impact is not defined by scandal or labels, but by courage. His story asks a question gospel music can no longer avoid. If worship is rooted in truth, who decides which truths are allowed to be sung and which must remain silent? These gospel legends healed millions with their voices, yet many were denied the right to live honestly. Some chose silence, others chose truth and paid the price. Their stories force us to ask a difficult question. Was gospel music ever truly about holiness, or was it about control? If God gave them these voices, why were they punished for being human? And even today, has the church really changed or just learned to hide better? We want to hear from you. Do you believe these artists were victims of their time or victims of the system? Share your thoughts in the comments, and don't forget to support Black Excellence Legends for more untold stories.